folks, welcome to the Leith Hat Knit in the Round tutorial. If you're a new knitter looking to knit a stylish, really cute beanie with a fold over sort of triple layer brim, all in stockinette, then you've come to the right place. It feels like this style of hat is everywhere right now, and my best-selling muscle wear pattern, I think it's been our most popular pattern for the last 2, maybe 3 years, has a really similar style. I hear all the time from new knitters who really want to knit muscle bra but maybe don't feel like their skills are quite there yet. It's a pretty simple pattern, but it does use a few more advanced techniques. So with Leith, I set out to create a pattern just for beginner knitters. The construction of the hat itself is really simple. It only uses basic knitting skills. The pattern itself is written specifically to be accessible to new knitters, to introduce you to sort of general pattern conventions and how a knitting pattern works. And it also includes lots of step-by-step tutorials for all of the skills involved in knitting the hat, so you can work from the video or those step-by-step tutorials. If you recently learned to knit and you've maybe made a scarf or some hand warmers, some small projects, and you know how to cast on, work the knit stitch, and maintain an even-ish tension so you don't have lots of drop stitches, your stitches are all roughly the same size, then you're ready to knit Leith. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll need a copy of the Leith Hat pattern, which you can purchase on my website, azalda.com, or on Ravelry, and I'll put links to the pattern in the show notes down below. And the pattern includes 6 sizes from baby to adult extra large, so that you can knit it for the whole family. And it also includes lots of extra information about how to read a pattern and step-by-step tutorials for the skills included in knitting the hat. So you can work from the written pattern, the step-by-step tutorials, or from the video, and kind of switch back and forth depending on what suits you. In this tutorial, you'll learn how to read a written pattern, swatch and check your gauge, how to knit in the round, how to shape your knitting with simple decreases, how to read your knitting, that is, how to look at your knitting and tell whether you're on the right side or wrong side, whether a stitch is a knit or a purl or maybe a decrease, and you'll learn how to complete a project with some simple seaming and finishing techniques. If you would rather work Leith flat on 2 needles, the pattern does include knitting flat and knitting in the round directions, a separate Leith knit flat video tutorial as well, so I'll link to that for you as well, and you can choose the knitting method that you prefer. To knit the Leith hat, you will need a copy of the pattern. It's a downloadable PDF pattern which you can purchase from my website, azalda.com, and from Ravelry, and I've put the link here and in the show notes. So you can go and get your pattern and come back for the tutorial. And then you will also need yarn. You'll need a DK or light worsted weight yarn. I've got a couple of examples here. You want to use a yarn that's got a bit of memory. It's kind of squishy. Memory just means that when you sort of tug on it, it springs back into place. Something soft, squishy that you want to wear in a hat. Wool, acrylic, or a blend of the two work really well. I think this one is actually a recycled polyester. That works well. It's spun to give it this kind of nice bouncy texture. You want to avoid anything like a cotton or other plant fibers because those don't tend to stretch. They tend to be kind of too heavy with not enough elasticity for a hat, and your hat might not fit, or it might kind of stretch out of shape, and it probably won't be very warm either. So do avoid those. If your yarn comes like this in a twisted skein, you will want to open that up and sort of untwist it. It will make a big loop, and then wind it into a ball. If you try and knit from the loop, you will get a horrible tangled mess. And you can use special equipment for winding that, but you don't need to. If you buy from an LYS, a local yarn store, they might offer to wind it for you. But if you don't have ball winding equipment, don't worry. You can enlist the help of a friend to sort of drape it over their hands and hold that loop open while you wind it into a ball. Or you can drape it over the back of a chair, or personally, I like to sit on the sofa with my knees up and just drape it over my knees. You do get it stuck if you want to stop halfway through. But wind your yarn into a ball before you start knitting with it. And then check the amount of yarn that comes in one ball or skein of your yarn. So this one says there are 275 yards. Before beginning, you'll want to check the number of yards or meters given in the yarn information section in the pattern, and check how much you need for your size, whether you can use 1 skein or you might need to buy 2 skeins. You'll also need needles. You'll need a 16-inch or 40 centimeter circular needle, The size given in the pattern is just a suggestion. The size is a 4mm, that's the size I used to get the gauge in the pattern, but you might need a slightly different size. You'll also need a small pair of scissors to cut your yarn, a tape measure to measure the length of your pat, a blunt tapestry needle, that's for weaving in ends and whip stitching the brim, and you'll need one sort of ring stitch marker to mark the end of your round. Leith Hat pattern includes directions for a little mini swatch like this. For a project like a hat, you do want it to fit well, which means getting your gauge right. Gauge is the number of stitches that you have over a certain width, and you want to make sure that your gauge matches my gauge. So I might knit a bit looser or a bit tighter than you do. Everyone knits a little bit differently. And if your tension is different, then you'll want to compensate for that by changing the needle size and using a different size to the size that I used. In the future, if you're making a larger project like a garment that you want to fit well, do make a larger swatch, something like this, so that you can measure your gauge over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. A mini swatch like this just isn't accurate enough for something where you have more fabric and you want a more precise fit. But for a hat, where I'm sure you're eager to get started, a mini swatch is a good way to check your gauge. And you might notice my swatch looks a little bit messy on the wrong side. And that's because I knit this swatch in the round, or sort of a fake in the round technique. And I did that because most people get a slightly different gauge when they knit flat versus knit in the round. When you knit stockinette in the round, you're knitting every round. But when you knit stockinette flat, you knit one row and then you flip your work over and you purl the next row. And the difference between your tension for knit and purl can mean that you get a different gauge. To knit this swatch in the round, I've begun by casting on 16 stitches onto my circular needle, and instead of flipping that over to purl a row, I'm going to slide these stitches to the other end of my needle. If you've ever knit I-cord, this is similar, but don't worry if you haven't. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to trail my yarn across the back. So my yarn is attached here. To knit this row, I'd usually want it to be attached here, close to the needle tip. It's not. I'm just going to trail it across the back and knit that row anyway. And I usually use my left hand to kind of grip that yarn so that it doesn't all get pulled through and get pulled really tight. Then I'm going to knit across that row, and at the end of this row I'm going to do the same thing. So slide my stitches to the other end instead of turning the work, instead of turning it over, and bring the yarn behind. And that will allow you to kind of fake swatch knitting around without having to knit a large tube. And that's why we have these strands of yarn across the back. It's not a big deal. To measure it, you just need to kind of uncurl things. If those strands get really tight, you can just cut up the back of them so that you can lay your swatch flat. And then I've got this little gauge measuring tool. You don't need one of these. A ruler is perfectly fine. But I'm just going to line that up with 2 inches and then count my stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's perfect. I've got 10 stitches for 2 inches or 5 centimeters. That's the gauge given in the pattern. If you get more stitches, so maybe 11 or 12, that means that your knitting tension is a little bit tighter than mine. And the best way to compensate for that is to use a larger needle size. If, however, you have fewer stitches, maybe 9 or 8, then your individual stitches are larger than mine, your tension is looser, and you want to compensate for that by going down a needle size. So if you have more stitches than 10, go up a needle size. If you have fewer stitches than 10, go down a needle size. The first step on the actual hat is to cast on. So I've cast on onto my circular needle. I'm making the adult medium size here. If you're new to following written patterns with multiple sizes, then this might be new to you. In the pattern, when it describes the sizes, it gives you several numbers or several measurements separated by commas and parentheses. So you have one measurement for the smallest size, for the baby size, and then inside parentheses, a list of other numbers so that get progressively larger. So the way this works is that the position of your size in the initial sizing description is the position of any number that pertains to your size throughout the pattern. So I'm making the adult medium, so I know, looking at the sizing information, that the 4th number in the list is always going to refer to my size. So before you get started, it's a good idea to work out which size to make, and then go through and mark up your pattern, whether that's with a highlighter on paper or with a PDF app on your phone or tablet. Go through and mark which numbers are relevant to your size. So I've cast on the correct number of stitches, counted it a few times just to be sure. And when you're joining in the round, it's really crucial that you don't have a twist in your cast on. If, for example, this was sort of flipped over like this, you can see there's a twist here. If that twist is in my cast on and I start knitting in the round, which means joining these two ends together, then that twist will always be there. It will be there throughout the fabric. You won't be able to get rid of it. I like to work my way along the needle, making sure that the sort of loop of the stitches is facing one way, and then the little kind of twisted ridge along the bottom of the cast on is always facing in the same direction. So kind of inwards in towards my circle. This is a long tail cast on. It's my preferred method for a sort of basic cast on. A general purpose cast on. If you have a different cast on method that you already know or that you like, do go ahead and use that. But if you're interested in learning long tail, we do have a tutorial video, so I'll put a link to that so that you can check it out and practice the long tail cast on. And now I'm going to join this in the round. I'm going to put in a stitch marker. I've got a simple ring marker here, so I'm going to put that on my right needle tip, and then to join in the round, all I need to do is knit my first stitch. Just gonna sort of sort my yarn out first. Should have done that before I put the stitch marker on. So stitch marker on, and then knit the first stitch. And it can help to pull the yarn tight so you don't get a gap there. And we're going to work stockinette. So when you're knitting in the round versus knitting flat, stockinette is produced by knitting every round. When you get to the end of the first round, simply slip the marker from your left needle to your right needle and then continue knitting. And it's a good idea when you're putting down a project that you're knitting in the round, not to put it down right at the end of the round because your marker is just going to fall off. So always knit a few stitches after the marker to hold the marker in place. And continue knitting until you have a tube of stockinette that you think looks close to the measurement given in the pattern, and then you can use your ruler or your tape measure to measure that length before transitioning to the crown section. If you've done a couple of rounds, it's a good idea to double check for sure that you don't have a twist. So I like to kind of uncurl my fabric. Stockinette does always curl up, and just work my way around the needle, making sure that I can arrange things so that the fabric is always kind of facing in the same direction, and be sure that there's nothing twisted there. So that looks okay. If you do find a twist, the best option is just to pull the needle out and rip it out, unravel it, and start over. There are some tricks, but I find that usually works the best. So it's less soul destroying if you catch it early. So do take a moment after you've knit a couple of rounds to double check for any twist in that cast on. Section on this hat, and I'm ready to switch my fabric around. So the bottom half right now is stockinette. I've been knitting every round, and that stockinette side is facing outwards. My goal is to end up with the brim looking like reverse stockinette, and then the crown section being in stockinette. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to reverse the direction I'm knitting in order to switch from stockinette to reverse stockinette without having to purl every round going forward. To create a smoother join where I make that change, I'm going to use a short row technique called a wrap and turn. Don't worry if you've never done short rows, I'm just going to show you how to do that. I'm at the end of the round and I'm ready to do my wrap and turn. So I'm going to start by slipping my end of round marker, and then I'm going to bring the yarn to the front and then slip the next stitch purlwise. So insert the right needle from right to left into the front of that stitch, slip it off the left needle, and then bring the yarn to the back between the needles, and slip that stitch back to the left needle. So you can see it's got a little wrap of yarn, like a little scarf around it. And then I'm going to turn everything and bring the yarn once again to the back between the needles, because I'm going to start knitting. And I want the yarn at the back in order to knit. I slip my marker and knit a couple of stitches just so the marker doesn't go flying off. And then I can reach inside and pull the fabric of the hat inside out so that I'm set up for knitting around as usual. And now if I carry on knitting, I'm going to get stockinette fabric above this section of reverse stockinette. And you want to knit to one stitch before the end of the round to that wrap stitch, and then I'll show you how to knit that wrap so that you don't end up with a small hole here. I've knit around on my first row of this section until I've got to the last stitch, that wrap stitch, and now I'm going to knit the wrap together with the stitch so that I get a nice smooth finish. And to do that, I'm going to insert my needle, helps if your needles are a bit pointier than these ones, under the wrap and then through the stitch. It can be a bit tight, and then wrap the yarn and bring that yarn through both the stitch and the wrap, and then slide the stitch off the needle. And it might take a bit of sort of pulling on it, but then the wrap should end up kind of popping behind the stitch to the wrong side. Often when you work short rows and you sort of knit the stitch together with the wrap in the round, your tension can get a little weird in the stitches just before, but you can just grab your needle tip or a darning needle and kind of even out some of that slack. Just work it along and distribute it between the stitches. And of course, when your hat is complete, you're going to fold up this folded brim and stitch the cast on stitches to this top purl ridge here. And then when you wear it and fold it up again, this wrap and turn is going to be completely hidden on the inside. So if it's a little uneven, don't worry about it at all. Once you've completed the length given in the pattern for your size of this second section of the hat, it's time to work the crown shaping with decreases. If you're new to shaping your knitting with decreases, I'm going to show you how to decrease using the knit two together decrease and how to read the sort of decrease instructions in the pattern. I'm just a couple of stitches away from the end of my final round before the decreases so that my marker doesn't fall out. So I'm going to knit to the end of the round and then I'll show you the first decrease round. Before I do that, here's a look at what we're going to be doing. This hat has had all of the decrease rounds worked. I just need to use my yarn on a tapestry needle to kind of close up the hole I've still got left in the middle. And you can see that this kind of shaping pulls the hat together, gives a gathered effect. I really like that with a pom-pom on it. It's also a nice sort of slouchy three-dimensional effect for this hat style. It's also probably the easiest shaping there is to work, which is why we're going to start with this. There's not a lot of counting or placing lots of markers or doing different kinds of decreases. It's a really easy option to get started for your first hat project. I lay this down so you can see it more clearly. We're going to be working 3 decrease rounds. So here I've got, this is my first decrease round. I can see the 2 stitches coming together for my decrease. Second decrease round, third decrease round. In between we'll work a plain knit round so that our decrease rounds aren't really smooshed together on top of each other. So let's get started with our first decrease round. If you've got an end of round marker there to help you keep track of where your end of round is, you want to slip that across to your right needle. This decrease round in the pattern uses a sort of pattern grammar that might be new to you if you're new to following written patterns with abbreviations. So the round begins with knit two together. And that little block of instructions is enclosed within brackets or parentheses. And if you see those brackets around a block of instructions, that means that you should treat those instructions as a little unit of sort of smaller instructions that you will repeat. So you'll work it and then you'll go back to the first instruction within those brackets and start the sequence again. And you'll keep repeating it either a certain number of times. Your pattern might say some instructions in brackets, and then afterwards it will say 6 times. So you would do that little block a total of 6 times. Or it might say, as it does in this case, to keep doing that until you get somewhere. In this case, we're just going to keep doing that until we get to the end of the round. You might have a sequence that you keep doing until you get to 20 stitches before the end of the round, or to a marker, a sort of intermediary marker. Whatever it is, you just treat it as one little block, and then you keep doing that sequence over and over again until you get to wherever you need to get. I've slipped my marker, and then I'm going to do knit 2, which is the first instruction within our little block, knit 2, and then knit 2 together. If you're new to decreasing and you do want a more detailed, slower, step-by-step tutorial on how to work a knit 2 together, we do have one of those, so I'll link that for you. And then you can just come back over here once you've practiced your knit 2 togethers. And you'll get lots of practice on this round, because now we're going to do our little block again. Knit 2, knit 2 together. Knit 2, knit 2 together. The nice thing about this pattern is that you don't ever have to count higher than 2, other than when you're measuring your sort of length of your project. So it's easy to memorize, you don't need lots of markers to help you keep track. And if you do think you maybe just did knit 1 or knit 3 in between a decrease, don't worry too much. It's gonna be pulled together, it'll look just fine. Continue repeating that little block of instructions all the way to the end of the round. If you have to put your project down and pick it up again while you're in the middle of this round, you might not be quite sure where you were when you stopped within that sequence. So it can help to kind of practice reading your knitting. Reading your knitting is looking at your stitches and kind of identifying what kind of stitch you worked. So if I look at this, I can see this looks like a plain knit stitch. I've got a little V below it, so does this one. This one I can see I've got 2 stitches coming together, so that's a knit 2 together. So I must have completed my little sequence and I'm ready to start another one. If when I looked at my knitting I saw the decrease here followed by a knit 1, I'd know I was in the middle of a sequence, and that knit 1 will need another knit stitch to have my 2 knit stitches next to each other before I work a decrease. When you get close to the end of the round, you should have the exact number of stitches left that you need to work a final repeat of the sequence. So our knit 2, knit 2 together is going to use up 4 stitches, and I've got 4 stitches left, so that's perfect. If you don't have the exact number of stitches, maybe you dropped a stitch somewhere or accidentally did a knit 2 together, don't worry about it, just knit those extra stitches, ignore it, and we'll kind of fudge the decreases. It's going to be fine. Don't rip out your whole project because your stitch count was slightly off on this round. In between each of our decrease rounds, we're going to work a plain knit round, so I'll slip the marker, knit this round, and then it will be time for decrease round 2. Decrease round 2, our little sequence is going to be knit 1, knit 2 together. So I'm going to knit 1, knit 2 together, and then repeat that. Knit 1, knit 2 together. And it can help you keep track of where you are, especially if you put your project down, to know that those decreases on this round will kind of stack on top of the decreases worked on the previous round, and then the knit 1 will always come after that little kind of line of decreases. Continue repeating your sequence, knit 1, knit 2 together, to the end of the round. If you're knitting one of the smallest sizes, you might find that as you work this decrease round, your stitches get really tight and sort of stretched around your circular needle. If so, just skip ahead a little bit to the 3rd decrease round, and I'll show you how I handle sort of dealing with it when my stitches don't fit neatly around my circular needle. Don't forget after decrease round 2 to work the next round, the plain knit round. I'm going to do that, and then I'll show you how to do decrease round 3 and how to handle it when your stitches don't fit comfortably around your circular needle anymore. Decrease round 3, our little sequence to repeat, is just a knit 2 together. We're going to knit 2 together all of the stitches. not all together, but in pairs. And that's going to really reduce our stitch count dramatically. And I'm already kind of at my maximum number of or minimum number of stitches I can fit on this length of needle. I've worked my first knitted together really just to hold my marker in place. And then what I'm going to do to deal with the stitches is I'm going to pull on my right needle tip to slide all of my stitches down onto the cable, so that I then I can kind of get my needles aligned. And then my last step is I'm going to maybe about halfway around, it doesn't matter exactly where, I'm going to kind of pinch the loop of this cable and just slide my stitches up onto the needle. And then I've got my needles arranged so that I can work across this first batch of stitches that are on the left needle tip. Remember, this is decrease round 3, so we're going to knit 2 together in all of the stitches. So knit 2 together, knit 2 together. Keep doing that until you get across that first batch of stitches. It might be a little bit awkward, that's okay, it's just one round. And then here I've got just one stitch hanging out, so I can't work my knit 2 together. So what I'm going to do first of all is just pull that left needle and slide that stitch down onto the cable, so it kind of groups together with this batch. And then I'm going to turn everything over so that the stitches I haven't worked yet are face up. And then I'm going to pull on my loop on that cable, slide those stitches onto the left needle tip that I haven't worked yet, and then kind of keeping, I like to kind of keep my pinky in that loop to keep a little bit of a loop there. I've now got my right needle tip pulled out, I'm going to bend that, and then I can use that to work the second batch of stitches. So knit 2 together, knit 2 together, and continue like that until you get to the end of round marker. If you've ever seen magic loop or tried it yourself, this is kind of like a mini magic loop. I wouldn't actually use this method with a needle this short for very long. It's not super comfortable. Magic loop is a lot more comfortable with a longer needle, but it's serviceable when you're just knitting 1 or 2 decrease rounds. And then when you get to the end of this round, we're not going to need the marker anymore. You don't want to sew it into your finished hat. I've got one stitch kind of awkwardly on that left needle, so I'm just going to slide that onto the cable. And then our last step is going to be to break the yarn and use a tapestry needle to thread it through all of these stitches. To close the top of the hat, you'll need a tapestry needle with a blunt tip and an eye big enough to thread your yarn through, and a pair of scissors. And make sure that you've removed the end of round marker so that you don't sew it into your project. And you're going to cut the yarn so that it's 12 inches long, 30 centimeters. Thread it onto your tapestry needle, and then you want to set up your stitches so that the first stitch of your round, that's the stitch furthest away from the tail of the yarn, is on the left needle tip, and then you can slide all of your stitches kind of closer together. And as we go, we'll slide them all up onto the left needle. And then you're going to take the tapestry needle and just go into each stitch from right to left and slide it off the left needle, like so. Take it slow so you don't miss any stitches. Then pull the yarn through. We'll tighten up in a minute and flip it over when you get halfway across. Slide. Just trying to stop my needles scraping on the table. I know it's a really irritating sound. That went well. Maybe I can jam it in there. So slide the rest of your stitches onto the needle tip and then continue transferring them onto the yarn in the same way. We can remove our circular needle, and we should have something like this where the yarn is going through each stitch. I like to go through all of my stitches a second time before pulling the yarn up tight, just to give it a bit more security, and it helps to keep that hole closed. So I'm just going to carefully go through each stitch following the original path of the yarn and making sure that I'm careful not to sort of split the yarn, so I'm not going in through the yarn. I seem to go through each stitch. And then I'm back to the beginning. So I want to pull on that yarn until the hole closes up, and then it helps to put your other hand inside the hat and then bring the needle through the center of that hole and then turn the whole thing inside out. Put another good tug to really close that up, and then I like to start securing the end by just going sort of under a few stitches and back up a couple of times, making sure that's hole's nice and tightly secured, and then you can weave in the end as normal. Our hat should now look something like this. We've got the top gathered together and closed up at the top, and then the top half is a stockinette, the bottom half is reverse stockinette, and our last step is going to be to fold up this triple brim and sort of sew it in place. So I'm going to begin by folding it back on itself with the reverse stockinette sides together. I've got the outer, what will be the outer face of my hat facing outwards, and I'm folding this brim part just back up on itself so that my cast on edge meets where this reverse stockinette ends. And then to join those, what I'm going to do is seam that cast on edge to this very top sort of row of purl bumps on this reverse stockinette brim section. I'm going to use my cast on tail. I don't think this one is going to be long enough to reach all the way around the hat, but it can be easier and less tangly to use a shorter piece of yarn and then join in a second one. So I've got enough here to do at least some of the seam, so I'm going to start off with that. You can of course join a new piece of yarn if you need to. So if you look closely, you should be able to see where you've got sort of an extra row of purl bumps and a little step, and that's where we switch stitch patterns, and that means that's the beginning of the round. So you want to make sure you're lining up the kind of join in your cast on where the tail is attached with that jog in your stitches. That will mean you've got sort of one column of stitches sewn together with at the top and bottom. You're sewing together the top and bottom of the same column. And if you don't do that, what happens is your fabric often biases, it kind of slants, and if you sew it in place just where it falls, it might be like this, and you're kind of sewing that bias fabric into place. Your brim will always be a little bit sort of skew with, a little bit turned. So we want to counteract that tendency and make sure we're lining up the sort of top and bottom of the same column. So that looks good. That's sort of, I think, my first stitch where that little jog is. So I'm going to bring my needle and come sort of down from top to bottom under this first purl bump. So right at the top, that first loop, and then I'm going to go through one loop of my cast on edge. Doesn't matter too much exactly which loop you go through, as long as you're sewing one stitch on the sort of top of the brim to one stitch on the cast on edge. So again, I'm going to go under the top loop and then under one loop on the cast on edge and pull that through. And this is kind of a whip stitch technique. It's not the only way you could sew these together, but it's pretty quick, and this seam will really be very hidden on your finished project. So once you have sewn all this together, you'll fold this brim like this, and that seam is going to be kind of inside that fold on the brim. So it's not even visible on the inside of the hat. On the inside of the hat, we just have our transition from stockinette to reverse stockinette. So I'm going to unfold that and continue sewing in this way all the way around the hat. I hope you enjoy knitting the Leith hat as much as I did. As you've probably noticed from this video, I've made several and don't seem to be stopping anytime soon. even as an experienced knitter, it's been a really fun, easy project and a great way to use up my DK weight stash. I'd love to see your works in progress and your finished projects, so do make sure if you're sharing those on Instagram or other social media to tag your project with Leith Hat and tag me as Zolda. You can find me on my website, zolda.com, and on Instagram and Ravelry as Zolda. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, where I'll be sharing more tips and techniques for improving your knitting skills and projects to help you build a great handmade wardrobe. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I will see you soon.